Bailey made her best friend enter into a pact, and the pact was that if one of them were to die, they would make up a sign that they would communicate to the other one, so the other one knew that they still existed. I mean, what 13-year-old thinks of this shit, I don't know, but Bailey did. So Bailey's sign to her friend was that she was going to take a blue magic marker and she was going to put it in an unusual place. And Bailey's friend that said after the funeral, she walked back into her bedroom, and neatly placed on her computer keyboard was a blue magic mark.
Welcome to What the Fuck Just Happened. I'm your host, Liz Enton. If you listen to the intro, you know my story. If not, here's a brief summary. I'm a sciencey skeptic, and when my dad died, I took a shot in the dark and decided to investigate if there was any possible evidence of an afterlife. I assumed that was as realistic as Santa Claus, but I was desperate. However, I was so blown away by what I discovered that I wrote a book and launched this podcast. In this podcast, I will be talking to some fairly normal people about some really weird shit. I speak with everyone from psychic mediums and afterlife researchers to ordinary people who've had some inexplicable experiences. So come, listen. There's no need to draw any final conclusions. Keep an open mind and wonder, what the fuck just happened? Hi everyone, today I have Bob Ginsberg from Forever Family Foundation on, and that's really exciting to me because he has been one of my rocks and mentors along with his wife, Phran, who I've talked about quite a bit on this podcast. And so it's kind of meaningful to have him on. So, Bob, can you introduce yourself?
Well, you just gave me a good introduction, but as you said, I'm Bob Ginsberg. I co-founded Forever Family Foundation with my wife, Fran, as you mentioned, back in 2003. And we're an organization that has grown over the years. We now have 13,000 members in 76 countries, and our programs keep expanding, and we keep exploring. And it just shows what a thirst there is for this type of knowledge. And what we've found over the years, as you well know, is that evidence of an afterlife can be very helpful in one's grief. To some people, they don't need any science. People like you and me do, but a lot of people don't. But I think it's important to form some sort of a basis for belief, before you could, jump into it. Because we're not about blind faith, although for some that works, but we're evidence-based faith.
And Bob and I are similar in that both of us thought this was all complete bullshit, would never have done this if we did not have a life-shattering loss. And I think we both have taken a long time to even think this was possible. So what did you think before your loss of Bailey about afterlife? And then what was the first bit of evidence that made you start to think this could be possible?
As I think back, I just never really contemplated life after that too much. I mean, I was a left brain logical thinker, and I just thought that a belief in an afterlife was a nice thought, but so was believing in Santa Claus, but I didn't know how that could possibly be because we were our brains, and when our brains are no more, we're no more, and that's the end of discussion. I've told the story a couple of times that way back, before the foundation, I was playing golf with a friend of mine, and we were in a golf cart together, and we were waiting to tee off at the next hole. And my friend Kenny turned to me, and Kenny had recently lost his wife to cancer, only a few months before. And he said, "Bob, I have to tell you something." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Well, I went to see a medium, and I wasn't really quite sure what a medium was, but alarm bells were going off in my head because he said, well, she told me all of these unbelievable facts about, my wife that she couldn't possibly have known. And he probably saw that look that I was giving him, the look that people give me now. And he just looked at me and he said, "Well, you don't believe any of this, do you?" And I gave him some lame answer like, "Well, who knows? Kenny, you never know." And I went home and I remember clearly saying to Fran, "I just saw Kenny and I'm so worried about him. He's going to see some gypsy fortune teller. She's going to take all his money. He's overwhelmed by his grief." And that's what I thought, and then look at my life today, so I have a lot of patience and respect for people who don't believe that our consciousness can survive our physical death, because I was one of those people. And as you mentioned, I would say it took me about 7 or 8 years before I really came to that knowing stage. So, in that respect, you can call me a hypocrite because we started the foundation. I'm giving talks about evidence of an afterlife, and I didn't fully buy in myself. So, you know, and for me, I mean, to your question about what changed me, there wasn't anything that like hit me over the head. It was a gradual process. Things kept happening. I was reading hundreds of books. Fran was having many, many experiences that couldn't be explained, and I just kept dismissing them, dismissing them to coincidence. And then, just one day, it just dawned on me that I can't continue to dismiss, the evidence. It's overwhelming, and it kind of turned the corner. Luckily, I did have some personal experiences that helped me along the way. But I wish I was like a lot of people where I just bought into it right away. But that wasn't me, and I know it's not you.
It's certainly not me. I wish it was. I'm on 6 years, and while I still think it's very probable there's an afterlife, I'm still not completely convinced. So I don't know. Let's see if 7 years is my turning point, like you. So you said Fran had some amazing experiences, and then you had some amazing personal experiences too, and we had really amazing experience with a dream. Would you want to share one of Fran's amazing early experiences and then one of yours?
Well, I mean, we have to go back to the beginning of how this all started, because my son and my daughter were in a car accident, and the morning of the accident, Fran woke up in bed like it was about 3 in the morning, and she was trembling and shaking, and I said, "Well, what's the matter?" And she couldn't talk, and I asked her again, "What's the matter?" And she just was staring straight ahead, and finally she said, "Something horrible is going to happen today." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" And she said, "I can't tell you exactly, but our lives are going to be changed forever today." So I normally would not take that seriously because I didn't so believe in anything like visions or precognition and things of that nature. But we were married for decades, even at that point. And there were many times that Fran had these kind of visions, and they all played out exactly the way that she said. They happened to be all good things, but logic told me if she was right then, she could be right now. And to make a long story short, I watched over our three kids the best that I could throughout the day. And I let my guard down at night. And my son, we had two cars, and we were in a restaurant. My son and my daughter were involved in this accident, and my daughter didn't survive her injuries, and my son was seriously injured. And about 3 months later, when it became clear that my son was going to survive his injuries, I hadn't thought about it for 3 months because I was in shock. But then it dawned on me. I said, "Wait a second, like, how did Fran know?" And then I became consumed, or I don't even if consumed was the right word. I became obsessed with finding out how she knew. So now logic told me that there were only two explanations. One, some people are able to catch a glimpse of future events. Or two, I was open to the possibility that somebody was sending her a message, and that the possibilities there was that message coming from somebody that was still alive or somebody that's no longer embodied. So I started meeting with scientists and researchers across the country that studied consciousness, because I needed to find out if 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 there was a possibility that my daughter still existed in some form. So that is really how I went from, my life doing a complete about face. It was really, when we started doing this work, we started the foundation. Admittedly, it wasn't for me. I had no desire to help people at that point. I just was looking for my own survival, a way that I could, deal with this. Of course, that changed over the years, but initially, it was my own way of trying to work things out. And then we learned about things that that you have written about. I mean, not only mediumship, but near-death experiences and end-of-life experiences, deathbed visions, and reincarnation, and after-death communications, and things of that nature. And the more I learned about consciousness, the more convinced I got. I became.
And like me, you do not have abilities of your own, but you had two dreams.
I had, over the course of several years, 74 dream visitations from my daughter. And when I say dream visitations, I'm talking about a visitation dream is different from a regular dream. I call them regular dreams because they're kind of a rehashing from your subconscious of events and things you're worried about, and they don't make much sense, and they're all discombobulated and not in any order, and you forget them as soon as you wake up. And a dream visitation, very tactile. You could talk to your loved one. You might smell them. You might hug them or kiss them and so forth. So because Fran told me to, I journaled all of them, so that gave me a lot of hope. I had several experiences that defied logic. I went to a well known medium. Again, this is before I believed in anything and before the foundation. I went because Fran asked me to go. And, we're sitting there, and the medium gave me three extremely obscure pieces of information that nobody but Fran could have known because they had just happened. And then I remember it was in Manhattan. I was driving home with Fran that night, and I was just trying to. My mind was racing because I'm trying to figure out the trick. I said how to be a trick, and I couldn't figure out the trick. So I mean, I was open. That probably was an instance that helped to open me up to the possibilities.
They only visited all you guys at the same time in the hotel.
Yeah, that was strange. So after my son was going, after he was released from the hospital, he was going to an outpatient clinic that treated people that had brain injuries, and it got to the point where he was getting much better and he was able to travel. And I was worried about my middle daughter, who was at Carnegie Mellon University. So we decided to fly up to Pittsburgh. So it was me and Fran and my son John and his girlfriend at the time. We checked into a hotel, and Corey, my daughter, decided that she'll check into the hotel too, and we'll all be together for the weekend. And I went to sleep that night, and I had Bailey came to me as if she was right in front of me, and I was so, I mean, excited is not the word. I was so overwhelmed that I couldn't stop my heart from like bursting from my chest. And Fran was putting on clothes because she was going to take me to the hospital because she thought I was having a heart attack. And eventually she calmed me down, and I fell back asleep. And then I had another, a visit. Bailey wasn't stopping, and I had three of these visitations in one night. The interesting part is in the morning, I found out that Bailey also came to Fran, and then we met my kids for breakfast, and I found out that Corey had a visit from Bailey at the same time that Fran and I were having the visits, and my son's girlfriend also had a visit from Bailey. So, when I stepped back from that, I said, wait a second, four people. We happened to be in the same geographical location in the same hotel at the same time, had these visitations. So that told me something about the nature of consciousness, where consciousness can be everywhere at the same time, past, present, and future. It splits. So that was another profound moment. That did I walk away convinced? No, but it was another tool, to put in my bag and to build upon.
Yeah, like what Leslie Kean says, it's like a bunch of little sticks, and when you put them all together, it becomes this thick. I forget exactly how she described it. When you put them all together, it becomes like a thick log or whatever. And but each one on its own is not going to do it because you can keep explaining.
The little sticks build a raft, that you can cross. Early on, I remember we had a conference, and Bruce Grayson, who's a near-death experience researcher and a medical doctor, summed up his talk by saying, look, it's easy to explain away one particular discipline of research. Like you could explain away mediums, you could explain away near-death experiences, you could explain away deathbed visions and reincarnation. But when you step back and you take all of the evidence as a whole, the thing that makes the most sense is that our consciousness survives a physical death. And that always stuck with me because I always encourage people to just to absorb and keep learning, and eventually you'll come to your own conclusion.
What always amazed me too is it sounds like Bailey was amazing at signs, and there's a sort of Morse code that I remember you told me really early on when I would harass Phran and Bob and the mediums. I'm surprised I didn't get thrown out of Forever Family events, but I was following around with multiple questions saying, well, what makes you actually think this could be true? And all different variations of asking that repeatedly. And one of the stories you told me was this amazing story related to what sounds like a Morse code.
Yeah, Fran got a new car shortly after Bailey's passing, and she told me that she was driving and the radio was off because she didn't like to listen to the radio while she was driving. And then this sound that she could only describe as Morse code was coming out of her radio, even though the radio was off. And she said, and she even told me what it sounded like. It was like da 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 da. So she turned the car radio on, and it continued. And over the course of the next several weeks, we started to hear that same code coming out of all sorts of things on our house. So it came out of our alarm system. It came out of a microwave. Microwaves don't make sounds. It came out of TVs that were turned off. I mean, that came out of alarm clocks. So, well, this is, I can't explain it, but it's weird. And then I was driving my own car that I had been driving for 3 years, and I had the radio on, and son of a bitch, I hear that da 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 at a mic on my car. So I immediately shut the radio off, and it continues. Well, we we were working with a scientist who was coming to New York to do a lecture for us, and he had been while he was there, I told him about this, and he was the only person besides Fran that knew about this. So he's in the middle of his lecture in this big lecture hall with 500 people, and I'm sitting somewhere near the front in the audience. And in the middle of his lecture, out of the PA system in the lecture hall comes da 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 da. So he stops his talk and he's looking in the audience to find me, and he finds me, and I just hold up my hands and I shrug my shoulders like I can't explain it. So we go home, and then he said, "Look, we have to do an experiment," because he was working with mediums, research mediums that he was doing experiments with. So he said he told Fran to light a candle and to ask Bailey in spirit to go to one of the mediums who we didn't know. Her name was Janet. All we knew was that her name was Janet and she lived in St. Louis. So he said, ask Bailey to let Janet know if Bailey is sending this Morse code. So Fran, as she always does, follows directions, lights a candle, says, Bailey, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to be very specific. I need you to go to this medium. Her name is Janet. She lives in St. Louis, and let her know if you're sending me Morse code. And forget about it. And then the next day, I I was working. I went into my office and turned on my email. And the first email was from, the scientist, and it was a forward of an email that he had gotten just then from this medium, Janet. And the email said, I have no idea what this is. I've never experienced anything like it before, but somebody is sending Morse code. And when I read that, I was in my office and I think I let out like a scream because that was insane. I could not imagine how that could happen. Now, you might say, okay, is that evidence of an afterlife? Perhaps, maybe not. But whatever it was extraordinary because if you can rule out fraud, and in this case, I think we could because the medium was not in cahoots, with the scientists. They were conducting research. That was an extraordinary thing that really gave me a great deal of hope because I couldn't explain it.
I mean, it's at least showing consciousness is behaving non locally in some way. And if it can behave non locally, that's a huge step in favor of survival.
You're right. And on those lines, I mean, you made me think of the other thing that probably was a really big turning point. This was back in 2005, and I had been reading extensively, and I was reading books, some of them going back 100 years old. And I read a book that was written, I think, in the 1920s about remote viewing. And for those who are not familiar with remote viewing, there are some people that could, for lack of a better way of describing it, they send their mind or their consciousness to a distant location, and then they're able to see that location, and then even draw accurate diagrams of what they see. And it was used in the Stargate program by the CIA, which is now declassified, and you can read about it. But in any event, so I devised this experiment, and I told everybody, all the members of the foundation that wanted to participate, that every night between 9 and 9:15 p.m., I was going to draw a picture. And I asked anybody, even if they thought they had no intuitive ability at all, if they wanted to take part, every night at that same appointed time, draw a picture. And at the end of the 5 nights, mail those drawings into me, physically. And I purposely wouldn't think of what I was going to draw until like 10 seconds before, because I wanted to try to eliminate the possibility that they were reading my mind, which you could relate to, was you would have done the same thing. So then on the last day, on Friday, I said, you know what? I'm going to screw with everybody. I'm not going to draw a picture. I'm going to draw a geometric shape. And I decided to draw a dot with concentric circles around the dot. So now I'm done with the experiment, and the envelopes start to come in, and I'm all excited, and I'm opening them up, and I'm looking at the series of drawings, and I was pretty disappointed. There was nothing substantial. I could stretch some, but it really was, to me, it was a complete failure. And the very last envelope I opened up was from a woman in Bend, Oregon, and she only participated 4 of the nights, but in 2 of the photos, including the one with the geometric shape, she got exactly. I mean, I'm talking about identical to what I drew. And in the other two, I had read in my research that sometimes the remote viewers, they get all the components, but they don't quite put it together in the same way. So she had all the components in the other two. So the interesting thing about it is I drew those geometric shapes on Friday, but she drew them on Wednesday. So I had to say to myself, okay, who was remote viewing whom? Right? Because we know in remote viewing there's no time and space and distance, and there's things. Sometimes remote viewers would see things from the past, and sometimes they would see things in the future. So the reason that was important to me was that here I was in New York at the time. So I was sitting there at my desk with my brain in my skull. She's sitting 3,000 miles away with her brain in her skull. If we believe in material science, this is not possible, right? I mean, your brain is consciousness and it doesn't extend beyond your body. But here was proof that it did. So, that to me was very important because if you don't believe that the mind can act independently of the brain, then you can't believe in an afterlife. It's a prerequisite, right? So to me, that was a turning point. I know you can relate to something like that. Maybe some people can't, but that was a very important moment.
I actually took a remote viewing class with the Rhine and with Paul Smith. He's going to be a guest on here shortly. And I had similar experience. I didn't think I was going to get anything. And then I was used as an example in one of the classes. And I was like, what the fuck? Like, how does this happen?
People are always using you as an example, Liz. You notice that?
I don't know if it's always positive. Rubber gloves, I guess. Bob and Forever Family used me as a regular example of skepticism because one of the mediums, our mediums we've mentioned before, Janet Mayer, to book a reading with her, she wants to use a paper check. She feels the energy from the paper, so she asks you to fill out and send a paper sheet. And I didn't want to get fingerprints. Also, I know I mentioned a paper check. I got an anonymous money order, so people don't think I fucked up there. And I wore rubber gloves. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if they have like CIA connections at this point. This was before I even met anyone at Forever Family or started volunteering. So I wear rubber gloves. And to me, this seems normal. And I casually mention it in a conversation once. And to this day, no one has let me live it down.
No, I certainly haven't, but that's taking it to an extreme. But, when we're evaluating mediums, I mean, we do it under controlled conditions, but that's taking the control to a whole new level, Liz, right?
Probably. I mean, I sometimes wondered about facial recognition technology. So a lot of my readings early on, I would do on the phone. And I wondered a little bit about voice recognition technology. That was the one thing I couldn't figure out how to eliminate, but I eliminated everything else. So I was just joking at our recent retreat that I'm going to start using a voice disguiser. So that's what the mediums were like. So if we get a message from some random name and it's like, hello, yes, I've had a couple readings before. They're like, well, we'll pretty much figure out who this is.
Yeah, well, you mentioned a voice disguiser, and I shouldn't even bring this up, but I'll tell you a story that's totally unrelated if you want. We'll
I know the story. You know what? I will say
we'll save it for another show.
that's a different show. Yeah, you know what?
Okay.
I will comment on that because this is an important message. I felt, and Bob can back this up, we laugh so hard every Forever Family retreat. And I had about a year, maybe not quite a year, where I thought it was so wrong to laugh or so wrong to have fun. I was like, my dad's dead. I don't have a right to laugh or have fun. And I tend to be a pretty humorous person. So there is nothing wrong with laughing, with having fun. Also, don't deny if you feel like shit either. You're allowed to feel like shit. Don't listen to it's been this long, you need to feel better.
Yeah, but no, you raise an interesting point, and as it relates to grief, because a lot of people, and I certainly did, the first time that I laughed, after my daughter died, was I felt tremendous guilt, like how dare so, and these grief retreats, as you mentioned, there are a lot of people there that are in horrible grief and great despair, and you have to we always try to interject, some humor because you have to lighten it up a bit, I mean, I'm not talking about doing a comedy routine, but you have to mix in some lightness with the darkness, and that I think people appreciate that.
So here's a concern that I hear from a lot of people. And I know I had a few really bad readings early on. I will say lucky. The mediums will say it was all planned. My first reading, she was not even certified anywhere, happened to be amazing. And I was just like, the same as you. What is the trick? What am I missing? What's going on? Because even if she had used facial recognition technology, she knew stuff that was not Googleable. So, what about all the people who comment that they've gone to a lot of mediums or a couple medium readings and the information's just very general and they leave so dejected? What are your thoughts about the majority of mediums?
Well, I mean that's why I wrote the book that I wrote, the medium explosion. But I state, and I'll stand by it, that 85 to 90% of the mediums that are practicing today can't do what they claim. So I'm not saying that they're all frauds, but they have some intuitive ability, but so do you and I, and so do most people, all in varying degrees. But they don't have the ability to communicate with a discarnate entity. So, yeah, people, they tend to think in terms of like a medium is a medium. There's no difference. Like a doctor is a doctor or a lawyer is a lawyer. But even among doctors and lawyers, there's a tremendous disparity in their abilities and their ethics and so forth. So that's one of the problems with mediumship because, and I worry about that all the time because if you have somebody that's in grief and they're not sure if there's an afterlife, they're sitting on the fence, waiting to see where they're going to wind up. And then they go to a medium and they have a horrible reading and they walk away saying, "This is just a crock of shit," and this is there is no afterlife, and I'm deluding myself, and it makes them feel even worse if that's possible, than they did before. So that's why we take mediumship very, very seriously. I always counsel mediums that it's something not to take in a lighthearted way. You're dealing with people. You're not a grief therapist, but you're dealing with people that are in various stages of depression and and so forth. So it's a very precarious position that they're put in. It also puts a lot of pressure on the medium, because they know, and a lot of times they're the lifeline for that person that's sitting there. Now, there are some mediums, and I just encountered one or two today that sent in inquiries about certification and so forth, and they still believe that giving the person a message, telling the person, the sitter, the person getting the reading, that their person in spirit loves them and is okay and didn't feel any pain, like their job is done, and that makes the person feel better, and it very well might. But how could you accept that unless you really believe that the medium is communicating with your loved one? How are you supposed to really believe the message? So first, what I want to hear from the medium is first, I present the sitter with all the evidence that they could verify. Then I could give them the message from their loved one, and they can take that because they know that we're in contact. And that's something that a lot of mediums just don't get. They don't think that the evidence is that important. I mean, which is essentially what a medium is. A medium is a person that purportedly can provide evidence from people that are no longer embodied. So it's an issue. And there are no, unlike, think about anybody else that's dealing in the mental health profession, there are ethical guidelines, there are proficiency guidelines, there are regulatory bodies, there's continuing education. There's nothing. I mean, you can go out tomorrow and, Liz the medium and start charging $500 an hour and start your business, and it's an issue.
As Phran would always say, anyone can just go put up a shingle, and next thing you know, they're calling themselves a fucking medium.
Right, right.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. I have taken quite a few mediumship classes to study, just scientifically watch the process, knowing I don't have abilities. And, I've met people just with the best of hearts, but you can see they're not evidential, and they operate from almost a religious type of belief based approach to this. And then they give those type of readings, and they often get clients that feel the same. And then the reading isn't evidential. I mean, just one example with me, I was giving somebody a reading in the class, taught by Joe Shield, one of our mediums, doing the assignment saying, say what pops into your head. And things were popping into my head, but they were all very clearly logical. Like, I'm sitting in front of someone, the woman was probably in her 60s. I assume she lost a grandmother. I assume her grandmother baked. So all these things were popping in my head, and they were right, but they were very clearly like sit in front of someone, guess who they lost, and guess some things about them. And the woman was like, "Oh, see, you're good. You definitely should try to start getting clients." I was like, "I absolutely should not."
I know. I totally understand what you're saying because I had exactly the same experience. I went with Fran to a retreat. I forget this one whether it was in Bahamas or was in Europe. It might have been in England, but in any event, they did a similar exercise where they wanted you to just pair off with somebody and say, just, keep talking. And in the first one that I did exactly what you did. I sized up, my left brain was sizing up their approximate age and their ethnicity from the way that they talked and where they were from. And I was just giving them bullshit that was pretty accurate, but it was bullshit, and I felt horrible afterwards, like, because that person really was believing, what I'm saying. And I just was a learning experience because I realized how a lot of unqualified or fraudulent mediums can operate. I mean, we also know today that, especially after COVID hit, that mediums stopped doing readings in person. They were doing it on Zoom and other platforms. I mean, you mentioned, Joe Shield. He caught a medium that was doing a reading on Zoom, and the medium had a split screen on her laptop, and on one side was the sitter, and on the other side of the screen was the woman's Facebook page, and the medium was just spitting back everything that she was reading on the person's Facebook page, and the sitter thought that she was the greatest medium in the world, but she was a total fraud. So that's something that could not have happened 100 years ago in the Victorian era, when there was no Google and there was no internet. But now there's so much information, so it's a genuine concern. So we always tell people, give the medium the least bit of information that you can, before you get a reading.
That's why I either just give my first name or just give a completely fake name, because you just don't know. And in my
Yeah,
book, I disguise a few things. Like I wanted, in terms of honoring him, to give my dad's real name, but evidence is too important. So I gave my dad a fake name. Everything's true, but I disguised a few signs. I had to disguise a few things for my mom because she's like, I do not want a single person to know that XYZ. I'm like, okay, okay. But yeah, it's, from what I understand, just a tiny percent. The majority are good hearted and believe what they're doing, and a tiny percent a tiny percent, or I don't know if a tiny percent, but a percent are actually intentionally fraud. And then a percent are genuine and able to do it highly skilled and accurate. That's my impression.
yeah. When I wrote the book, it didn't make me very popular in the mediumship community, but I didn't do it as an expose, like, to expose mediums. It was quite the opposite. I wanted to show that the 10% that can truly do this and are very, very gifted are extraordinary, and they can change people's lives. What we need to do is identify more of them, instead of, and that's why we have to evaluate 10 mediums to find one that we can certify, because that same percentage holds up.
Right. And it really is the white crow theory. All you need is one white crow to disprove the theory that all crows are black. So if one can do it, we found more than one, that means consciousness survives. And that's really all that matters at the end of the day.
That's true. That's why sometimes let people sit in, group readings, and they get very disappointed if the medium, doesn't come to them, which happens often, in groups. I mean, I used to think of it the other way, because if I'm sitting next to somebody and the medium is giving them very, very specific and evidential information, obscure information that the sitter can verify, I thought, well, if that person's loved one still exists, that means that mine does too. So there's some value in hearing other people, get evidential readings.
I had an experience with that early on. I had signed up for one of Laura Lynn's groups, one of our mediums, and I surprisingly fucked up, because I don't really fuck up, and I paid with my credit card or my PayPal. And I was like, oh shit. That was something that just ate away at me. As you know, can imagine me early on. And this was before I started volunteering with you guys. I'd found her through Windbridge, which is run by Dr. Julie Beischel and Mark Bacuzzi. And I went and to her first workshop. Then I went back to another, and I went with a friend of mine. I made him pay cash, and he got read and I didn't. And it was very accurate. And I was like, okay. She actually could Google me and didn't have any of his information. Like I would be an much easier Google than, I questioned facial recognition technology, but I was like, but how would that have all worked? And then I was thinking fingerprints on the cash, but then how many people touch cash? I mean, these are all the things going through my mind, but she knew non-Googleable stuff, and I would have just been a much easier target with my real information. And I assume most people there gave their real information. He was one of the only ones. I made him do it all fake name, everything, and he got a reading. And I was like, there's something to that. But yeah, I like when other people get read too. I would score all early on, I would score myself against everyone else's readings. And I'm like, these are highly accurate, and none of this would apply to me, or very little would. So that was very helpful to me.
Yeah, I mean, I did something similar. In all the years that we've been doing this and working with some extraordinary mediums, neither Fran nor I ever got a reading from one of our certified mediums. Not because we knew that they were great, but we couldn't trust the information because they knew too much about our story. So even if I got a great reading, I would question it. Did they just know it? So, I mean, you mentioned Leslie Kane before, and when Leslie was researching the book Surviving Death, she went to Ireland and she got a reading, from a medium. And when she came back, she called me and she asked if she could bring the transcripts of the reading over to the house and would I score them because she knew that that's what I did. And when I scored there were but 3 or 4 readings that she gave me, and the medium was unbelievably accurate. It had like a 92% accuracy rating, so I knew she was the real deal. And then after Fran passed, Leslie called me up and she said, "Would you like to get a reading with this medium, Sandra O'Hara, who now herself is in spirit?" And I said, "You know what? Let me think about that." And then I called him. I said, "Yeah, I'd like to get a reading on one condition. The only information I'm going to give her is my name is Bob, and God knows how many Bobs there are in this world, and you can't look that up." And I asked Leslie if she would pay for the reading using her own PayPal account, and I of course reimbursed her for that. And I got the reading, and it was a very strong evidential reading. And me, as I'm getting the reading, I'm scoring it at the same time. And Bailey came through, and Fran came through, and it was a great reading. And the reason it was great for me is that I trusted the information. She couldn't have identified me. So that was, I think it's important, I mean, the reading is that much stronger if you can eliminate everything in your own mind that questions it.
I'll just share an interesting story about Sandra O'Hara as well. I had a reading with her very early on. I heard about her through Lloyd Arbach, and fake everything. And she was so accurate. I mean, she got memories from my dad. She described my cat who passed. And one thing I scored as wrong. She said, "Who is Joe?" And I said, "I don't know any Joes." And she said, "Well, Joe's someone, if he's not a friend of yours now, he's someone who's going to be very important." And I was like, "Yeah, okay, wrong." So now, as most of you listening, Joe Peretta was one of my first guests. He's a psychic medium through Forever Family. He's become one of my best friends. I mean, we talk all the time. And so that it's just, I've actually gone back and checked a lot of my old readings, and stuff I scored wrong about the future. A lot has come true. And that's been amazing for me.
Then you get into the question of, is it psychic information or is it mediumistic information? Because she knew that Joe was going to come into your life. Was there a discarnate entity that was telling her that? And that's what makes it so difficult to score these things, because it's hard to parse the difference between the two.
I know Forever Family certifies mediums for accuracy and eliminating fraud. To what extent can you talk about this process? I know there's a lot of secrecy behind it.
No, it's really not that much secrecy except the actual, scoring. I mean, it's a process that, we never solicit any medium, but if a medium sends us an inquiry and the details are on the website for familyfoundation.org and they express interest, we send them a series of questions, nothing in depth, just to get a general idea of where they're at and if there are any red flags. And if it looks good, we invite them to complete quite extensive application that goes into great detail. When that comes back, it gets reviewed by a committee. And if the committee says that, yeah, we'd like to move on with this evaluating this medium. An interview was arranged, and then the interview is reviewed. And if that looks good, they're invited to participate in a session. And a session used to take place back in the day in 2005. We used to do it in a hotel in a big ballroom, and we used to have bring in dividers and set up different stations, and we used to evaluate like 8 or 10 mediums at once. Now we do it via Zoom because it's a hell of a lot easier. And each medium does a reading for 5 different sitters. So they do a series of 5 readings. The sitters are all trained by us because they know about mediumship. They know about specific information versus general bullshit. They know about how to score the reading and so forth. And then we have 5 different scoring methods that we use based upon the composite of all 5 readings. And if they meet the target in each one of the 5 categories, then they gain certification. So it's not an easy thing, and it's very, even for good mediums, it can be kind of distressing to go through that process because mediums have never been put through in a position where they're being evaluated in a somewhat clinical atmosphere. Just about 2 months ago, I was doing a session with the medium, and during the session, the medium started to have a nervous breakdown. I mean, she had to like stop the reading, and I had to, even though I'm not a psychologist, I had to try to use all my skills to calm her down and reassure her and so forth and get her back on track. So I understand. And for that reason, if a medium doesn't gain certification, we invite them if they want to do it again because now they know what to expect. And, I didn't want that to affect, the process. Of course, there has to be some ability. I mean, they have to show some ability before, we want to, invite them back, but most do. And now that I think about it, I mean, the data is pretty much stays true. If they failed once, they usually fail a second or a third time. But we want to at least give them a chance.
Yeah, I could see maybe a very evidential medium, as you said, could get very nervous and maybe they just, or maybe they're having an off day, or maybe, they're young and they train further and come back in a couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, and that happens. They do get more training, and sometimes people they just apply too early. If they're doing it for 6 months, I mean, we're evaluating mediums sometimes that have been doing it for 30 years. I mean, it's like anything else. You not only learn different ways of receiving information, but you learn ways to communicate the information that you're receiving. You could put 5 mediums together and they could all be getting the same information from a person in spirit, but they'll all interpret that differently. And when they try to put it into words, it comes out differently. So that's a skill within a skill, to be able to take the ineffable, something that can't be described, and put it into words. It's not easy.
And you gave an example when you train sitters of specific information versus general. Can you give an example for our listeners of what would be an example of general and what would be an example of specific?
You're Liz the medium, and you see me, and you can gauge approximately how old I am, and you say, Bob, I have your great grandmother here. Do you have a great grandmother in spirit? And what I'm thinking is, well, fuck yeah, she'd be 130 years old. So, yeah, you're right, and I would have to mark that as a hit because it's true. It's a true statement. You can't get more general, but it's still true. But if you say to me, Bob, I have your great grandmother Rebecca here, and she was actually an attorney when there were no women attorneys, and she had this unbelievable knack, for or hobby, and you describe that, or a food that she could. Well, that should be scored a lot more heavily than the first statement because now if you first of all knowing her name was Rebecca, the odds against chance are pretty remote that you could guess that. And when you combine that with 5 other obscure pieces of information, the odds become astronomical that you'd be able to guess all that. So that's a piece of specific information is weighted more heavily in a scoring as it should be.
Now, one thing I think that's fascinating about the Forever Family Foundation, and I think our listeners might be interested, tell us about the auxiliary board.
Well, so we have several boards. We have a scientific advisory board, which is made up of scientists and medical doctors and researchers. And then we have an academic advisory board, which is made up of professors and PhDs. And we have a medium advisory board, which is mainly made up of some mediums that have participated in research over the years. And then the board you mentioned, the auxiliary board, which is probably the only organization, for profit or not for profit, that has such a board because it's made up of dead people, people that are on the other side. We have not kept up with it in recent years, but for probably because Fran's not here kicking me in the ass to do it. But we used to gather our medium advisory board and ask them to get in touch with our, our members on the auxiliary board with specific direction of how the foundation should act, things that we should do and changes we should make. And we used to get some pretty interesting information that we would base our planning on, from our board. So, why shouldn't they remain part of our lives as, the same as the scientists and the doctors?
You have a very interesting story. Was it Arthur Hastings? Like you ask people if they'd like to be on the auxiliary board after they pass, and then you wait for a sign. Was that with Arthur Hastings with all the papers in Fran's office?
Yeah, sometimes more than me, was when that stuff. I mean, yes, we did that. That was the process. If somebody was nominated to be on auxiliary board, we wouldn't just put them on there. They would have to. They being the person in spirit, they would have to let us know in some way, give us a communication or a sign. And in Arthur Hastings' case, maybe I don't remember what his sign was. You do, evidently.
Oh, I can tell it. Fran told me this story. It was amazing. So I believe Fran or you, I don't know who actually asked, burned a candle and said, "Would you like to join the auxiliary board?" Fran goes down to the office the next morning and she sees papers scattered everywhere. And she's like, "Oh, the fucking cat's knocking everything over." So she starts picking up the papers and she sees the first one's from a paper by Arthur Hastings. The next one's a paper by Arthur Hastings. And she picks them all up and they're only papers by Arthur Hastings. And it's not like they were separated
Okay.
out in a special pile. They were just mixed in with every other. So she was like, "Okay, I guess we'll take that as a sign."
Yes, that's an perfect example. I mean, that was a sign, and then he got voted onto the board. You know, uh, Now that you mention him, he was a researcher in the field, and he was doing like a 2-year project using a psychomantium. He built a psychomantium in the university that he taught in, and actually, Fran and I went out to visit him and pick his brain, and we looked at the psychomantium, and then we eventually built one.
What is a psychomantium?
The Psychomantium is based upon what the ancient Greeks used to have. They used to go into these caves. It was based on sensory deprivation. So they go into these caves that were, there was some very, very dim light, and there were these reflecting pools, and they would sit there and just contemplate and see images form, out of in the reflecting pool. And the psychomantium is based on the same principle. You have like a cubicle with dark cloth on the end. We built ours out of PVC pipe, and in the front of the psychomantium there was a mirror. You could think of it as a mirror or a window, and then there's a nice relaxing reclining chair. It's about 4 feet in front of the glass, the mirror, and all you would do we had like a night light, that you would use that gives us very dim light. So the light was enough. If you put your hand in front of you, you could see the outline of the hand, but you couldn't see the hand itself. And people would sit in this room. You might call it a meditation chamber because it's similar. Gaze into the window about 45 minutes and have all of these experiences. Some would report seeing deceased loved ones, some would just see these anomalous lights and different forms that came in. So he did a quite an extensive study. Of course, Raymond Moody was the first one, that worked with psychomanthiums and did that. So it's one of the tools. When you're exploring, you'll try anything, right?
Yeah,
So,
within reason. Yeah, almost anything. Yeah, pretty much. I know we've talked about how probably so many more people have experiences than share it. And you had an experience with your doctor early on that was he shared. What happened with your doctor?
I didn't go to a doctor, for about 2 years after, Bailey died. And I had some ailments. So I figured, all right, let me go to the doctor and check it out. The doctor happened to be a friend of mine. So I went and I sat there in his waiting room, and finally called me in, and we go into the room. He shuts the door and he says, "But I haven't seen you in 2 years. How are you? Okay. What have you been doing?" I said, "You really want to know?" He says, "Yeah." I said, "I've been studying survival of consciousness." So he just looked at me and we started talking about something else. He didn't ask me why I was there medically, but we're just bullshitting. And then a couple of minutes go by and he says, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "What?" He said, "What's survival of consciousness?" So I start explaining to him the stuff we're talking about now. That our mind is different than our bodies, and continues on. And while we're talking, his nurse walked into the room, and it just turned out that his nurse had recently lost her baby to SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, and she was obviously distraught, but she was very interested in our conversation. So she's sitting there, and we're all talking. There's like a riot in his waiting room because there's like 40 people, and we're sitting there for like 45 minutes. So finally, she leaves, and then my friend Frank, the doctor, gets a very serious look on his face, and he said, "Can I tell you something?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "My father died 7 years ago." I said, "Yeah, I'm sorry." And then he said, "Well, after the morning that he died, I had a lot of patients that were in serious condition in the hospital, so I had to call my answering service. I had to get my messages. So I called, and the receptionist said, 'Oh, doctor, your father called.' And he said, 'My father died this morning.' And she said, 'Oh, I'm so sorry, doctor. I must have gotten the message wrong. He must have said your father-in-law.' He said, 'My father-in-law has been dead for 15 years.' And then he said, 'What time did the message come in?' So at 9:15, his father had died, at 9 a.m. He said, 'Read me back the message.' And the message was, 'Frank, it's me. I'm okay.' And this stuck with him. And over these 7 years, he never told a soul. He never told his wife. He never told his children. He certainly wasn't going to tell a friend, or even worse, a medical colleague. But he heard the stuff that I was talking about, and he knew I wasn't going to judge him. So he felt safe in telling me. And I guarantee you, fast forward 20 years, he's never told another soul. When I thought about that, and Fran and I were talking, I said, how sad is this, that he feels that he has to hold this in, this extraordinary experience, not tell anybody. And that's how it's one of the turning points when we knew that we had to start trying to get people to open up and share their experiences, because once they start doing that and it gets out in the mainstream, you remove the stigma and the judgment that goes along with it, and you can change the way we think about life and death.
Since I've quote unquote like come out about all of this, because I was pretty embarrassed and secret about in the beginning, so many people have said things to me like, okay, well, I don't really believe this and I'm not sure what I think, but, and then they share just a crazy story, or even like someone will email me, a stranger, and they're just like, found your podcast, people might think I'm crazy, but, and then they'll tell a story. And I just think all of us have these experiences. Most of us are not like mediums who have constant experiences, but most of us will have an experience now and then that we just cannot explain.
Yeah. And it's funny how they have to preface it by saying, "Oh, you're going to think I'm crazy, but," right?
Right. I'm like, did you see what I do? Like, I'm probably not going to think you're crazy.
Well, that's one of the great things about these grief retreats that we hold, is that everybody understands how everybody else feels, and they know that nobody's going to judge them, so they're free and open to talk about these things.
Bob, it's going on an hour. How much do you have a little more time?
Yeah, for you, Liz, sure.
Be careful. You know me. I can lock people into conversations on Afterlife for hours.
I don't sleep, so you're not scaring me.
So, one thing I know, and I know we've talked about this, and it's something that just, I still at times worry that this could be the catch. Why, if this evidence is so amazing, and I'm absolutely blown away by everything I've learned, I don't understand why everyone at CERN studying the Large Hadron Collider, all the big scientists aren't running, just amazed by this. They laugh it off and they dismiss it for the most part, not everybody. But why is this not front page news in the scientific and medical communities?
Yeah, I mean, I thought the same thing. Once I started reading everything, I thought, well, this is extraordinary. I mean, you have things with odds against chance in the trillions to one, and yet the evidence is not accepted because it challenges belief systems and education and training. If this is right, everything that they've been taught is wrong, and it's really hard. You know what's really interesting? There've been surveys that have been taken among scientists, material science. People that believe in Newtonian physics and hardcore core left brain thinkers. And in the survey, they'll ask them if they believe in God. If they have faith in a higher being, and the same people that dismiss everything else because it can't be replicated in a laboratory, the majority of them express the belief that they do believe in God, but they've never seen any evidence, but yet that faith is enough for them, but not when it comes to other things. That made no sense to me when I read that. I don't know how you can dismiss it. I mean, there have been, a famous quote from a scientist that said, "I wouldn't believe this stuff even if it was true," which is a pretty incredible thing for a scientist to say. So it's really, I think it's changing. I think as the years go by, I think more and more and people are open to it. You've noticed that a lot of today's physicists are starting to sound like spiritualists when they give their talks, with we're talking about a divine spark, and they may not. I mean, they may refer to it as we're all connected, remain connected from the Big Bang, but a divine spark is kind of the same concept. So I think that science and spirituality are not that far apart, and keep getting closer and closer. So who knows what the future will bring? But yeah, I can relate to what you say because I always wonder about the same thing. What is it going to take? And that's why, things that come out in the mainstream, like the Netflix series. I mean, look, the Netflix series wasn't, not all of it, was great, but it accomplished what I hoped it would, is that it opened up a lot of minds to the possibilities. Once you open up somebody's mind, they start exploring and learning, and that's a good thing. And we need more of that.
Most people had no idea who Jim Tucker was, for example, Dr. Jim Tucker was, before seeing that. Now, his name, Dr. Bruce Grayson, these very serious researchers that I had no idea existed until I started really digging. They're not part of the normal conversation. Dr. Jim Tucker researches cases of kids with past life memories. Anything I'd heard before about past lives was tied into what I would have considered nonsense and talked about in a very sort of, for lack of a better word, woo based way. That's how it's talked about in the mainstream. And then you find out about Jim Tucker and Dr. Ian Stevenson, who also he's passed away, but he also studied cases of kids with past life memories. And, people just don't know about these people.
Yeah, and even more important possibly than the actual scientific studies, or just the abundance of anecdotal evidence. Scientists don't, they dismiss anecdotal evidence because it's, to them, it's just stories. But when you have millions upon millions upon millions of people that talk about things that are all have common features, in their stories, you have to start to take it seriously. Everybody can't be making this shit up. It keeps happening and happening and happening and will continue to happen. So anecdotal evidence is a form of evidence. It's on the lowest rung in the scientific community, but it's perhaps the most important.
And there's just a consistency through it. That's what I noticed. Research has a consistency.
I mean, you made me think of something else when I talk about, anecdotal evidence. That might have been another changing moment for me in my progression is that when I'm sure I've told you this story, but after we moved to house in our last house in New York, my daughter Bailey was very, very upset, and she would constantly want to visit her old room in our old house because she didn't want to move and she loved that house and she loved her room. And every month she'd go to Fran and she'd say, "You take me, drive me back to the old house. I have to see my room." And Fran would say, "I can't do that. It's not appropriate. I can't knock on the door and just say, okay, can we go up so my daughter can see your room?" And Bailey, much like Fran, would never give up, and she just kept on and on and everything. So after Bailey passed, about a month or two later, I guess, Fran's first cousin, knew the people that bought our home, and they were together at some wedding or affair. And the person that bought our home went up to Fran's cousin and said, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" And she said, "Yes." And then she said, "My daughter, the woman who bought the house, who happened to have the same room as Bailey, she was a young teen, came down in the evening and was very excited and kind of distraught because she said that she saw the image of, well, she didn't say an image, she said she saw a young girl walk across her room." And the mother explained that her daughter never, ever had said anything similar, never had a bad dream, nothing. And the mother reassured her, and then she went back to bed, and that was that. In the morning, they're all sitting having breakfast at a table together, and Newsday, which is the paper in Long Island, was sitting on the table, and on the front page of the paper was the story of the accident that my children were in. And as it turned out, the girl saw the young girl walk across the room about 15 minutes after Bailey passed. So when I stepped back from that, my skeptic self, I said, "Wait a second. What would be the first place once she's freed of the body that Bailey would visit?" She asked for it like 100 times. She went back to her room. And the fact that she saw, the girl saw that right after, she passed, that was pretty significant to me. And it takes a lot, but that kind of, that was one of the things that turned the corner for me.
Yeah, and then Bailey she did an amazing sign with a blue marker, and she was already interested in signs, which to me is so interesting.
I mean, I didn't discover this until much later, but her best friend told Fran after the funeral that when Bailey was 15 when she passed, but when they were both 13 years old, Bailey made her best friend enter into a pact. And the pact was that if one of them were to die, they would make up a sign that they would communicate to the other one so the other one knew that they still existed. I mean, what 13-year-old thinks of this shit, I don't know, but Bailey did. So Bailey's sign to her friend was that she was going to take a blue magic marker and she was going to put it in an unusual place. And Bailey's friend that said after the funeral, she walked back into her bedroom and neatly placed on her computer keyboard was a blue magic marker. And she told Fran that she didn't own a blue magic marker and she hadn't used one. She doesn't remember, it had been years. So, of course, when I heard the story, I mean, Fran was moved and amazed. I dismissed it, of course, but that was probably the first sign, and then, later I learned that just because you don't have a body anymore, you still have a consciousness and you can still do psychokinesis, mind affecting matter. And that's how that kind of stuff happens. Yeah, I mean, and we also uncovered writings. She wrote a poem called The Wonder Awaits, which is all about when her time comes and she passes, how she's going to let the world know, that she still exists. So in that respect, I mean, how could we not do the work that we do, after finding that poem, right?
It's almost like everything was planned, which I guess is the question. How much is free will? How much is pre planned? But when I hear this, it makes me think this was what all of you came here for.
There are people, even especially among children, who have some sort of an inner knowledge that their life is not going to be long. Now, I can't tell you why. I mean, that maybe they're catching glimpses of the future, like as Phran did in that vision, or maybe it's part of a greater plan, where they came back for a purpose and their purpose was done. But I remember that with Bailey, we were on a college tour with her sister because her sister was 2 years older, and we figured we'll knock off, you know, two things at the same time since Bailey will be going to college 2 years later. So she went on the college tour with us. And in the middle of the tour, I couldn't find Bailey. And I looked across the lawn and I saw she had left the group and she was sitting on a bench. And there were tears like just streaming down her face. And I sat down next to her and I said, Bailey, so what's up? And, why are you crying? And she looked at me really serious and she said, Dad, she said, there is so much that I need to do with my life. What if I don't get a chance to do them? I said what most parents would say. What are you talking about? You're 13 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. Of course you're going to get to fulfill your dreams and all. But she knew, when I reflect back on it now, she knew. I don't know how, but I think she knew.
I know some people feel so guilty, especially after they lose a child or a young, a sibling who's young or their spouse when they're young. And it's just, they feel like, well, if I did this, maybe it wouldn't have happened. Maybe that can give some reassurance that some things are just pre planned.
Maybe. I have my own theories on that, but we don't have enough time to go into that. But I have a new book that's coming out in a couple of weeks, and I get into some of that stuff. If people are interested, they can go to foreverfamilyfoundation.org. I write a personal blog on beyondthefivesenses.com. And the foundation, we have a radio show every Thursday. We've been since 2005, and all the shows are archived on our website. We have 4 grief retreats a year and webinars and so forth. So people have resources, when they're in grief, and we encourage people to read and to learn as much as they can about what happens after death.
And Bob's current book, The Medium Explosion, I thought it was excellent. Really gave so much insight into mediumship and a lot of the concerns and questions and history of Forever Family. And what is your new book called?
It's called My Life Here and There. It's an autobiography. You will probably know half of well, not even half, but you'll know some of the experiences that are in there. And there's a lot of humor and there's a lot of sadness, but in a twist to the story, which I won't spoil for you, a good part of the book is devoted to what life is like in the afterlife. So I won't tell you more about that, but because I don't want to spoil it.
I'll put in the show notes where you can follow Forever Family and Bob, and follow our Forever Family social media, please. They were the number one organization, and Fran and Bob, the number one people who got me through those early days. I honestly don't know how to do it without you guys. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. You were always like another daughter friend. You were her project. She'd give you a lot of tough love. Yeah, because she knew you had potential. If people are interested, they can go to foreverfamilyfoundation.org. I write a personal blog on beyondthefivesenses.com. And the foundation, we have a radio show every Thursday. We've been since 2005, and all the shows are archived on our website. We have 4 grief retreats a year and webinars and so forth. So people have resources, when they're in grief, and we encourage people to read and to learn as much as they can about what happens after death.
And Bob's current book, The Medium Explosion, I thought it was excellent. Really gave so much insight into mediumship and a lot of the concerns and questions and history of Forever Family. And what is your new book called?
It's called My Life Here and There. It's an autobiography. You will probably know half of well, not even half, but you'll know some of the experiences that are in there. And there's a lot of humor and there's a lot of sadness, but in a twist to the story, which I won't spoil for you, a good part of the book is devoted to what life is like in the afterlife. So I won't tell you more about that, but because I don't want to spoil it.
I'll put in the show notes where you can follow Forever Family and Bob, and follow our Forever Family social media, please. They were the number one organization, and Fran and Bob, the number one people who got me through those early days. I honestly don't know how to do it without you guys. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. You were always like a another daughter friend. You were her project. She'd give you a lot of tough love. Yeah, because she knew you had potential.
I know. I think about her all the time. To get more information on what the fuck just happened, go to WTFJustHappened.net. There you can order my book, What the Fuck Just Happened? A Sciencey Skeptic Explores Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife. And you can learn all about how I came to conclude that there most likely is an afterlife. You can also learn about the early stages of my grief and the amazing, fascinating people I met along the way. You can also read about how much I harassed them trying to get evidence, see if they were cheating, and see if they were sane. There, you can subscribe to our newsletter. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. It makes such a difference, especially for a new podcast like this one. And if any of you have had a crazy what the fuck yourself, have any questions, feedback, or just want to say hi, reach out on either Instagram at WTF_just_happened_ or email me at hello@WTFJustHappened.net. And remember, you don't have to draw any final conclusions as you wonder what the fuck just happened.